Welcome back. The last two sections of Chapter 11, The Cotton Revolution, deal with a couple issues that are very graphic and difficult to hear, but are very important to understand historically. So, I will say that please beware as you listen to these that while it may be difficult to hear, if we don't cover this material and don't understand where we came from, then we run the risk of returning to it. And so historically, this certainly deals with issues that are difficult, but need to be discussed. Here in Section 5, we're going to talk about Southern cultures. Now, to understand the global and economic functions of the South, we need to understand the people who made the whole thing work. The South, perhaps more than any other region in the United States, had a great diversity of cultures and situations. The South still relied on the existence of slavery, and as a result, it was home to nearly 4 million enslaved people by 1860, amounting to nearly one-third of the entire Southern population. Naturally, these people, though legally unfree, developed a culture all their own. They created kinship and family networks, systems of trade, linguistic codes, religious congregations, and even benevolent and social aid organizations, all within the grip of slavery, a system dedicated to extraction rather than development, work and production rather than community and emotion. The concept of family, more than anything else, played a crucial role in the daily lives of slaves. Family and kinship networks and the benefits they carried represented an institution through which slaves could piece together a sense of community, a sense of feeling and dedication, separate from forced systems of production that define their daily lives. The creation of family units, distant relations, and communal traditions allowed slaves to maintain religious beliefs, ancient ancestral traditions, and even names passed down from generation to generation in a way that challenged enslavement. Ideas passed between relatives on different plantations, names given to children in honor of the deceased, and basic forms of love and devotion created a sense of individuality and identity that assuaged the loneliness and desperation of enslaved life. Family defined how each plantation, each community, functioned, grew, and labored. Nothing under slavery lasted long, at least not in the same form. Slave families and networks were no exception to this rule. African-born slaves during the 17th and 18th century engaged in marriages, often polygamous, with those of the same ethnic groups whenever possible. This, most importantly, allowed for the maintenance of cultural traditions such as language, religion, name practices, and even the rare practice of bodily scarring. This was very prominent for quiz purposes, remember, in the South, such as in places like coastal South Carolina, where ethnic homogeneity thrived, and as a result, traditions and networks survived relatively unchanged for decades. As the number of slaves arriving in the United States increased and generations of American-born slaves overtook the original African-born populations, the practices of marriage, especially among members of the same ethnic group or even simply the same plantation, became vital to the continuation of aging traditions. Marriage was the most important aspect of cultural and identity formation, as it connected slaves to their own pasts and gave some sense of protection for the future. By the start of the Civil War, approximately two-thirds of slaves were members of nuclear households, each household averaging 6 people: mother, father, children, and often grandparent, elderly aunt or uncle, and even in-laws. Those who did not have a marriage bond or even nuclear family still maintained family ties, most often living with a parent, brother, sister, or grandparent. Many slave marriages endured for many years, but the threat of disruption, often through sale, always loomed. As the internal slave trade increased following the constitutional ban on slave importation in 1808, the rise of cotton in 1830s and 40s, slave families, especially those established prior to the slaves' arrival in the United States, came under increased threat. Hundreds of thousands of marriages, many with children, fell victim to sales downriver, a euphemism for near constant flow of slave laborers down the Mississippi River to the developing cotton belt in the Southwest. And for quiz purposes, you need to know that during the Cotton Revolution alone, between 1/5 and 1/3 of all slave marriages were broken up through forced sale and migration. But this was not the only threat. Planters and slave owners recognized that marriage was, in the most basic and tragic sense, a privilege granted and defined by them for their slaves. And as a result, many slaveholders used slaves' marriages or threatens to squeeze out more production, counteract disobedience, or simply make a gesture of power and superiority. Threats to family networks, marriages, and household stability did not stop at the death of the master. A slave couple could live their entire lives together, even having been born, raised, and married on the slave plantation, and following the death of their master, find themselves at opposite ends of the known world. It only took a single relative, executor, creditor, or friend of the deceased to make a claim against the estate to cause the sale and dispersal of the entire slave community. Enslaved women were particularly vulnerable to the shifts of fate attached to slavery. In many cases, female slaves did the same work as men, spending the day from sunup to sundown in the fields, picking and bundling cotton. In other rare cases, especially among the larger plantations, planters tended to use women as house servants more than men, but this was not universal. In both cases, however, female slaves' experiences were different from those of their male counterparts, husbands, and neighbors. Sexual violence, unwanted pregnancies, and constant child rearing, while continuing to work the fields, all made life as a female slave more prone to disruption and uncertainty. Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman from North Carolina, chronicled her master's attempts to sexually abuse her in her narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Jacobs suggested that her successful attempts to resist sexual assault and her determination to love whom she pleased was something akin to freedom. But this freedom, however empowering and contextual, did not cast a wide net. Many enslaved women had no choice concerning love, sex, and motherhood. On plantations and small farms, even in cities, rape was ever present. Like the splitting of families, slave owners used sexual violence as a form of terrorism, a way to promote increased production, obedience, and power relationships. And this was not restricted to unmarried women. In numerous contemporary accounts, particularly violent slave owners forced men to witness the rape of their wives, daughters, relatives as punishment, but occasionally as sadistic expressions of power and dominance. As property, enslaved women had no recourse, and society, by and large, did not see a crime of this type as violence. Racist pseudoscience claimed that whites could not actually physically rape Africans or African Americans, as the sexual organs of each were not even compatible in that way. State laws, in some cases, supported this view, claiming that rape could only occur between two white people or a black man and a white woman. All other cases fell under silent acceptance. The consequences of rape, too, fell victim to the case of slaves. Pregnancies that resulted from rape did not always lead to lighter workload for the mother. And if a slave acted out against the rapist, whether that be her master, her mistress, or any other white attacker, her actions were often seen as crimes rather than desperate acts of survival. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that, this is terrible. But one of the worst cases was the case of a 19-year-old slave named Celia. And you'll need to remember what happens with her. She falls victim to repeated rape by her master in Callaway County, Missouri. Between 1850 and 1855, Robert Newsom raped Celia hundreds of times, producing 2 children and several miscarriages. Sick and desperate in the fall of 1855, Celia took a club and struck her master in the head, killing him. But instead of sympathy and aid, or even an honest attempt to understand and empathize, the community called for the execution of Celia. On November 16, 1855, after a trial of 10 days, Celia, the 19-year-old rape victim and slave, was hung for her crimes against her master. Gender equality did not always fall along the same lines as racial inequality. Southern society, especially in the age of cotton, deferred to white men, under whom laws, social norms, and cultural practices were written, dictated, and maintained. White women and free women of color lived in society dominated in nearly every aspect by men. Denied voting rights, women of all statuses and colors had no direct representation in the creation and discussion of law. Husbands, it was said, represented their wives as public sphere was too violent, heated, and high-minded for women. Society expected women to represent the foundations of the republic, gaining respectability through their work at home in support of their husbands and children, away from the rough and boisterous realms of masculinity. In many cases, too, the laws did not protect women the same way it protected men. In most states, marriages, an act expected of any self-respecting, reasonable woman of any class, effectively transferred all women's property to her husband forever, regardless of claim and command. Divorce existed, but it hardly ever worked in a woman's favor, and often, if successful, it ruined the wife's standing in society and even led to well-known cases of suicide. Life on the ground in the Cotton South, like the city's systems and networks on which it rested, defied the standard narrative of the Old South. Slavery existed to dominate, yet slaves formed bond, maintained traditions, and crafted new cultures. They fell in love, had children, protected one another using privileges granted them by their captors, and the basic intellect allowed all human beings. They were resourceful, brilliant, and vibrant, and they created freedom where freedom seemingly could not exist. And with those communities, resilience and dedication often led to cultural sustenance. Among the enslaved women in the impoverished but free, culture thrived in ways that are difficult to see through bales of cotton and stacks of money sitting on the docks and in the counting houses of the South's urban centers. But religion, honor, and pride transcended material goods, especially among those who could not express themselves that way. In the last section, we'll talk about religion and honor in the slave South. Economic growth, violence, and exploitation coexisted and mutually reinforced evangelical Christianity in the South. The revival of the Second Great Awakening established the region's prevailing religious culture, led by Methodists, Baptists, and to a lesser degree Presbyterians. This intense period of religious regeneration swept along the southern backcountry. By the outbreak of the Civil War, most Southerners who were affiliated with religious denominations belonged to either Baptist or Methodist faith. Both churches in the South briefly attacked slavery before transforming into some of the most vocal defenders of slavery and Southern social order. Southern ministers contended that God himself had selected Africans for bondage, but also considered the evangelization of slaves to be one of their greatest callings. For quiz purposes, you need to remember that missionary efforts among Southern slaves largely succeeded, and Protestantism spread rapidly among African Americans, leading to a proliferation of biracial congregations and prominent independent black churches. Some black and white Southerners forged positive and rewarding biracial connections. However, more often black and white Southerners described strained or superficial religious relationships. As institutions of slavery hardened racism in the South, relationships between missionaries and Native Americans transformed as well. Missionaries of all denominations were among the first to present themselves as pillars of white authority. After Louisiana Purchase of 1803, plantation culture expanded in the Deep South, and mission work became a crucial element of Christian expansion. Frontier mission schools carried a continual flow of Christian influence into Native American communities. Some missionaries learned indigenous language, but many more worked to prevent indigenous children from speaking their native tongues, insisting on English for Christian understanding. By the Indian removals of 1835 and the Trail of Tears in 1838, missionaries in the South preached a pro-slavery theology that emphasized obedience to masters, the biblical basis of racial slavery via the curse of Ham, and civilizing paternalism of slave owners. Slaves most commonly received Christian instruction from white preachers or masters, whose religious message typically stressed slave subservience. Anti-literacy laws ensured that most slaves would be unable to read the Bible in its entirety, and thus could not acquaint themselves with such inspirational stories as Moses delivering the Israelites out of slavery. Contradictions between God's word and the master and mistress's cruelty did not pass unnoticed by many enslaved African Americans. As former slave William Wells Brown declared, slaveholders hid themselves behind the church, adding that a more praying, preaching, psalm-singing people cannot be found than the slaveholders of the South. Many slaves chose to create their practice their own versions of Christianity, one that typically incorporated aspects of traditional African religion and limited input from the white community. Nat Turner, the leader of the Great Slave Rebellion, found inspiration from religion early in life. Adopting an austere Christian lifestyle during his adolescence, Turner claimed to have been visited by spirits during his 20s and considered himself something of a prophet. He claimed to have visions in which he was called on to do the work of God, leading some contemporaries, as well as historians, to question his sanity. Inspired by his faith, Turner led the most deadly slave rebellion in the antebellum South. On the morning of August 22, 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia, Nat Turner and 6 collaborators attempted to free the region's enslaved population. Turner initiated the violence by killing his master with an axe blow to the head. By the end of the day, Turner and his band, which had grown to over 50 men, killed 57 white men, women, and children on 11 farms. By the next day, the local militia and white residents had captured or killed almost all the participants, except for Turner who, for quiz purposes, you need to remember, hid for a number of weeks in the nearby woods before he was finally captured and executed. You also need to remember that the white terror that followed Nat Turner's rebellion transformed Southern religion as anti-literacy laws increased and black-led churches were broken up and placed under the supervision of white ministers. Evangelical religion also shaped understandings of what it meant to be a Southern man or a Southern woman. Southern manhood was largely shaped by the obsession with masculine honor, whereas Southern womanhood centered around expectations of sexual virtue or purity. Honor prioritized the public recognition of white masculine claims to reputation and authority. Duels was a big part of this, and you need to remember that this was part of a code that men developed to ritualize their interactions and to perform their expectations of honor. This code structured language and behavior and was designed to minimize conflict, but when conflict did arise, it also provided rituals that would reduce the resulting violence, like duels. If two men could not settle a dispute through arbitration of their friends, they would exchange pistol shots to prove their equal honor status. Duelists arranged a secluded meeting, chose the set of deadly weapons, and risked their lives as they clashed with swords or fired pistols at each other. Some of the most illustrious men in American history participated in duels at some point during their lives, including President Andrew Jackson, Vice President Aaron Burr, U.S. Senators Henry Clay and Thomas Hart Benton. But all but in Burr's case, dueling helped elevate these men to prominence. Violence among lower classes, especially in the backcountry, involved fistfights and shootouts. Tactics included sharpening of fingernails and filing of teeth to razor-sharp points, which would be used to gouge out eyes and bite off ears and noses. In a duel, however, gentlemen achieved recognition by risking their lives rather than by killing their opponents, whereas those involved in rough-and-tumble fighting achieved victory through maiming their opponent. The legal system was partially to blame for the prevalence of violence in the Old South. Although states and territories had made laws against murder, rape, and various forms of violence, including specific laws against dueling, upper-class Southerners were rarely prosecuted, and juries often acquitted the accused. Despite the fact that hundreds of duelists fought and killed one another, there is very little evidence that many duelists faced prosecution, and only one, Timothy Bennett, was ever executed. By contrast, prosecutors routinely sought cases against lower-class Southerners who were found guilty in greater numbers than their wealthy counterparts. The Southern emphasis on honor affected women as well. While Southern men worked to maintain their sense of masculinity, so too women cultivated a sense of femininity. In the South, femininity was intimately tied to the domestic sphere, even more so for women in the North than women in the North. For quiz purposes, you need to understand about the cult of domesticity, which strictly limited the ability of wealthy Southern women to engage in public life. While Northern women began to organize reform societies, Southern women remained bound to the home, where they were instructed to cultivate their family's religious sensibility and manage their house. Now, managing the house was not easy work, however. For women on large plantation, managing the household would include directing a large bureaucracy of potentially rebellious slaves. For most Southern women who did not live on plantations, managing the household included near constant work in keeping families clean, fed, and well-behaved. On top of these duties, many Southern women were required to help with agricultural tasks. Female labor was an important aspect of Southern economy, but the social position of women in Southern culture was understood not through economic labor, but rather through moral virtue. While men fought to get ahead in the turbulent world of cotton boom, women were instructed to offer a calming, moralizing influence on husbands and children. The home was meant to be a place of quiet respite and spiritual solace. Under the guidance of virtuous women, the Southern home would foster the values required for economic success and cultural refinement. Female virtue can be understood largely as a euphemism for sexual purity, and Southern culture, Southern laws, and Southern violence largely centered on protecting that virtue of sexual purity from any possible imagined threat. In a world saturated with sexual exploitation of black women, Southerners developed a paranoid obsession with protecting the sexual purity of white women. Black men were presented as an insatiable sexual threat. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that the racial systems of violence and domination were yielded with crushing intensity for generations, all in the name of keeping white womanhood as pure as the cotton that anchored Southern society. And this brings us to an end of chapter 11.